The wagon lurched once, hard enough to knock her shoulder into the doorframe, and then Nettie Voss was falling. She hit the ground in the dark, not a clean fall. Her left knee caught a rock, her palms dragged through frozen gravel, and the sound the supply wagon made, pulling away, was nothing dramatic. Just wheels, just the driver not looking back. She lay there for a moment, thinking she would get up. Then she thought she might be sick. Then she just lay there. The Cariboo Road stretched north and south of her in the October dark, and the pines on either side of it were so tall they erased the stars at the edges. She could hear the wagon for another minute or two. Then she couldn't. Nettie was 26 years old. She had come from Victoria with a letter of employment folded in her coat pocket, a position as a bookkeeper for a trading post outside of Williams Lake. The man who'd hired her, a Mr. Aldrin, she'd never met him in person, had arranged passage with a supply run headed north. The driver had seemed unremarkable. She had thought nothing of it. That was the thing she would return to. Later. She had thought nothing of it. She sat up. Her knee was bleeding through her stocking. Her bag was gone, still on the wagon, and with it her change of clothes, her second pair of boots, the money she'd saved for 8 months at the dry goods counter in Victoria. What she had on her person was a wool coat, a pair of leather gloves with a split at the left thumb, and the letter of employment which was now useless. She stood. She walked to the edge of the road and sat down on a log and tried to think clearly. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it the way you can feel a door swinging open in winter, that particular kind of cold that doesn't waste time. She had passed a cabin, maybe 2 miles back. She wasn't sure. It had been dark even then, and she'd only seen it because of a lamp in a window, a single square of yellow light back in the trees. She got up and started walking south. The cabin was further than 2 miles. By the time she found the track that led to it, her knee had stiffened, and her hands, even inside the gloves, had gone past aching into something that felt less like pain and more like absence. The track was just 2 ruts through dead grass, and the pines crowded close enough that the branches met overhead. She followed it, because she had no other option she could name. The cabin itself was low and long, built from timber that had gone dark with age. No light in the window now, a woodpile stacked under an overhang that went the full length of one wall, a shed to the left with the door sitting open an inch, and on the small porch in the dark, a dog that lifted its head and did not bark. She stopped walking. The dog watched her, a big animal, grey and brown, with the long legs of something that had spent its life on rough ground. It didn't move from its spot. She took another step, and the cabin door opened. The man who came out was not holding a lamp. He didn't need one. He seemed to navigate the darkness without consulting it, stepping off the porch and coming toward her with the unhurried certainty of someone who owned the ground he walked on. He was large in the way that certain men who work alone in remote places become large, not from vanity but from the accumulated requirement of their days. He had a beard that had been growing since some time last spring, and eyes that caught what little light there was and held it. He stopped 6 feet from her. She said, "I was put off a supply wagon on the road. I need to get warm." He looked at her for a long moment, then he looked past her, down the track, as if checking whether she'd come alone. "You're bleeding," he said. "My knee." He looked at her knee, then at her hands, then at her face. His name, she would learn later, was Croy. Just Croy. She would not learn whether that was a given name or a surname for several weeks, and by then it would seem impolite to ask. He stepped back toward the door and held it open. She went inside. The cabin was 1 room. It smelled of wood smoke and pine resin and something animal she couldn't place, pelts, she'd realize later, stacked on a shelf near the back wall. There was a wood stove going in the corner, and a table with 1 chair, and a lamp he lit, now with the manner of someone performing a task. They've performed 10,000 times, a bunk against the far wall. Shelves of canned goods and dried meat and tools she didn't know the names of. He put a kettle on. He didn't offer her the chair. She stood near the stove and felt her hands begin the painful process of returning to themselves. After a while he said, "Where were you going?" "Williams Lake, a trading post. I had work arranged." "With who?" "A man named Aldrin." Something shifted in his expression, just briefly. Aldrin's post burned down in August. She absorbed this slowly. The man who wrote to me didn't mention that. Might not have known. Might have known. He poured hot water into a basin and set it on the table. "Sit down." She sat. He crouched in front of her and looked at her knee with the same dispassionate attention he'd given everything else, then went to a shelf and came back with a piece of clean cloth and a small tin of something. He cleaned the cut without commenting on it. His hands were steady. "There's a store at the crossroads," he said, 14 miles north. "Supply wagon comes through again in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She did the calculation automatically, the way she'd always been good with numbers. She had nothing. No money, no bag, no change of clothes. She could not walk 14 miles on a knee like this, and even if she could, she had nothing to pay for a room. "I can work," she said. He sat back on his heels and looked at her. "I'm a bookkeeper," she said, "but I can also cook, split wood if you show me how. Do whatever needs doing. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for 3 weeks of room and board in exchange for labor." The silence that followed was long enough that she heard the dog shift outside on the porch, heard the tick of the stove. "I trap," he said finally. "Beaver, mink, marten. This time of year I'm out before light and I don't come back till late afternoon. You'd be on your own most of the day. That's fine. There's no one else here. No woman, just me." She understood what he was telling her, what he felt obligated to say. "I understand that." Another silence. He picked up the basin and took it to the door and emptied it into the dark. "You can have the bunk," he said, with his back to her. "I'll take the floor." She wanted to say that wasn't necessary, that she could take the floor, but the truth was her knee was throbbing badly, and she was so tired she thought she might cry if she tried to argue about it. "Thank you," she said instead. She was asleep before he'd finished spreading his bedroll. The first week was the hardest kind of hard, not dramatic, just relentless. She woke in the dark to the sound of him moving. By the time she'd oriented herself to where she was, he was already dressed, already had the stove stoked, already had his coat on. He left a cup of tea on the table and was out the door before she sat up. She found things to do. That had always been her nature. She didn't do well with idleness. It sat in her chest like a stone. She inventoried his food stores, which were extensive but disorganized, and made a record in a small notebook she found on his shelf. She swept the floor. She tried to cook something with what he had and managed a reasonable pot of porridge and a poor excuse for biscuits that she ate anyway, alone, at the table, watching the trees through the window. He came back in the late afternoon each day, with the quiet of a man who had been in silence for 8 hours and had not found it uncomfortable. He ate what she'd made without complaint and without much praise. He told her, occasionally, what he needed: more firewood closer to the door, water from the creek before it froze over in the morning. One of his traps had a bent trigger mechanism he needed to work on in the evenings. She did not ask about his life. He did not ask about hers. But on the 4th day, when she was splitting kindling in the yard and doing it badly, and he came over and wordlessly repositioned her hands on the axe handle, she felt something shift. Not warmth exactly. More like acknowledgement, the recognition that they were two people trying to manage something difficult in the same small space, and that they were, thus far, managing it. "Like this," he said. "Let the weight do it." She tried again. The wood split clean. "There," he said, and went back to what he was doing. It was the longest conversation they'd had. She learned things in those weeks that she had never expected to learn. How to read ice, which patches on the creek were safe, which looked solid and weren't. He explained it once, walking beside her on a morning she'd asked to come along, just to understand what his days looked like. He had been reluctant. Initially, she was slowing him down, but he explained the ice without condescension, pointing to the dark patches at the edges and the places where the current moved underneath and changed the color. How to skin a rabbit. He came home one evening with 3 of them, and she had been expecting him to handle it himself. But he set them on the table and looked at her and said, "May as well learn." She had made a sound she wasn't proud of. He had waited. Then she had done it, slowly and badly, and he had corrected her grip twice, and she had done the second one better, and the third one well enough. How to read the weather from the way the clouds moved over the ridge to the west. "That color," he said one morning, looking up, "means you've got maybe 6 hours." He was right. The snow came in the late afternoon, and it didn't stop. She had not expected to find these things interesting. She had not expected, in Victoria, behind her counter of ledgers and invoices, that she had any particular aptitude for country living. But there was something in it that fit her in a way she couldn't fully articulate. The logic of it, maybe. The way every action had a direct consequence. Chop the wood or be cold, salt the meat or go hungry. The causality was clean and honest, in a way the ledgers had sometimes not been, hiding as they did one man's interests behind another man's numbers. She thought about this at the creek one morning, watching the water move under the ice at the edges. She thought about Mr. Aldrin's letter, which she still had in her pocket. She thought about the supply driver, who hadn't looked back. She thought about Victoria, about the room she'd rented above the laundry, about the smell of starch and steam that had lived in her clothes for 3 years, about the other women at the counter, who were kind enough, but who spoke mostly of husbands, and of whom she had nothing in common with, because she had neither a husband nor the particular longing for one that seemed to organize their lives. She picked up a stone from the bank and threw it out onto the ice. It slid 20 feet and stopped. Behind her, the dog sat and watched her with its calm, undemanding attention. The storm came in the 3rd week, and it came hard. She'd seen the clouds the day before and known, the way she now knew these things, that it would be significant. But significant and what it actually turned out to be were different categories entirely. By the 2nd morning the snow was at the windowsills, and Croy had not gone out, and the cabin felt half its already small size. He was not difficult to be around in close quarters. That surprised her. She had expected a man who'd lived alone for this long to be rigid, to have routines she'd disturb simply by existing in his space. And there were routines. He had them clearly. The particular order in which he did things, the places where he set his tools, the way he moved through the small room with an economy that left no wasted motion. But he was not rigid about them. When she moved his knife to a different spot on the shelf, because it made more sense there for her. Reaching purposes, he simply moved it back the next day without comment, and she understood that was the end of that. And she stopped moving it. They talked more during those 3 days than they had in the entire first 2 weeks combined. Not about large things initially. About the storm, about whether it would ease by tomorrow, about the provisions they had and how long they'd last. He told her about a winter 3 years back when he'd been snowed in for 11 days and had run so low on meat that he'd eaten the leather strap of an old pack he'd had no other use for. She laughed. It came out surprised, louder than she intended. He looked at her as if he'd forgotten what laughter sounded like, not offended. Just recalibrating. She asked him how he'd come to the Cariboo. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he told her that he'd come up from Ontario at 19, following work, and that the work had led him further and further from places with many people in them, until he'd found that this particular lack suited him better than the presence had. He said it plainly, without self-pity and without apology. "Don't you get lonely?" she asked. She hadn't planned to ask it. He considered the question as if it deserved honest consideration. "Sometimes," he said, "but lonely's not the worst thing." She thought about that for the rest of the day. The storm broke on the fourth morning. The light that came through the window was the particular white of fresh snow under sun, almost too bright to look at, and she stood at the window and watched the yard and the pines and the way the whole world had been remade in the night into something clean and enormous. Her knee had healed. She had stopped thinking about it. The date in her notebook told her the supply wagon would come through the crossroads in 4 days. She had been marking the days the way she would a page in a ledger, precisely, out of habit, because imprecision was something she'd trained herself against. 4 days. She had enough money from the tin he'd left on the table. Payment for 3 weeks of cooking and wood and water, and whatever else she'd managed, to get herself back to Williams Lake and send a wire to Victoria. She could find other work. She was good at her work. She always had been. She should be glad of this. She turned it over in her mind all that morning, while she baked the last of the flour into bread, and listened to him outside, restacking the woodpile that had shifted under the snow. She should be calculating. Next steps, writing a list in her notebook, planning the most efficient return to a life with a flaw she recognized. Instead, she stood at the window and watched him work. He moved with the same economy he always moved with, unhurried and certain, each piece of wood placed as if it mattered where exactly it sat. The dog lay in the snow nearby with its chin on its paws. The trees caught the light in the way they do in the north. In October, sideways and golden, making ordinary things look briefly like something else. She was not sure when she'd started to feel at home here. She wasn't even entirely sure she was feeling it now. But when she tried to imagine the smell of starch and steam and the dry goods counter and the room above the laundry, when she tried to locate the feeling she'd had there, which had not been unhappiness, exactly, but which had been a kind of ongoing low-grade incompleteness, the sense that she was filling a position that could have been filled by any number of women with her skills, she found she didn't want to return to it. She went to the door and opened it. He looked up. "The bread's almost ready," she said. "I used the last of the flour." He nodded. "You'll need more before winter's well in." "I know. The supply wagon carries it," she said. "I could add it to an order before I go." He set down the piece of wood he was holding. He looked at her with the same patience he brought to everything, waiting. She found she didn't know what she meant to say next. She had thought she did. She stood in the doorway with the warm bread smell behind her and the cold, bright morning in front of her, and tried to locate the right words for something she hadn't quite finished deciding yet. "Or," she said, "you could just tell me what else you need for winter." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. He was one of the few people she'd ever met in whose silences she felt no pressure to fill. He picked up another piece of wood. "I've never kept a proper record of my stores," he said. "Always figured it by gut. Ran short twice." "That's not efficient." "No," he said. "It's not." She stayed in the doorway. The dog lifted its head and looked at her, then put it back down. "I could set up a system," she said. "Something that tracks what comes in and what goes out, so you know where you stand before it matters." He stacked the wood and turned to look at her directly. "That would take more than 4 days." "I know." The light came across the yard at its low October angle. Somewhere up in the pines a jay called once and was quiet. "The supply wagon can carry a message back," he said, "for whatever arrangements you need to cancel." It was not a grand declaration. He was not that kind of man, and she was not that kind of woman, and neither of them would have known what to do with one. But she understood what he was offering: space and purpose and the specific freedom of a life that demanded exactly what you gave it. She stepped back inside. "I'll write the message this afternoon," she said, "and I'll start on the inventory after." She heard him continue with the woodpile. She went to the stove and checked the bread, and it was ready, golden at the edges, and she set it on the table and went to the shelf where he kept his paper and ink. She began a new page. Stores, cabin north of Lac La Hache Road, inventory as of October 1886. Outside, the sound of the wood going up, the dog padding around the corner of the cabin, the particular quality of silence that comes after a storm, not empty but full of everything the world had set down and was now slowly picking back up. She wrote until the lamp needed trimming. She trimmed it and went on.